Graduate Research Fellow with Religion and Public Life Program, and I will be moderating tonight's event. But we also want to acknowledge that there are many competing interests going on this week and this night, and so that you were able to take time to come by. We don't take your time lightly, so we appreciate you for coming on tonight. I want to introduce our panelists for tonight and close the program briefly. First, let me introduce the Director of the Religion and Public Life Program, Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund. She is also the Herbert S. Archery Chair of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology. Our other panelist is also Greg Hahn, the Director of Interfaith Relations and Interfaith Ministries here in Greater Houston. And we also have the Reverend Matthew Russell, who's Associate Pastor at St. Paul's and also the Executive Director at Project Curate. The format for tonight, first will be Professor Ecklund. She will come give a brief presentation highlighting why we have come to tonight's event and why we've chosen this conversation. Next, following her panelists, Reverend Hahn will come, and then Reverend Russell will come and share what their respective organizations have been doing in response to Harvey. Then I will address a few questions to our panelists. All of them have been prepared by the students of the Religion and Public Life Program. And then we hope to save the rest of our time for the final portion of the evening, which is question and answers from the audience. When we open up the floor, we want you to think about your questions, and we say in advance, don't be affronted or offended if we ask you to kind of get to the point of your question. We want to make sure that you ask a question and kind of get that so we can get to as many people as possible. Is that cool? All right. So with that, let's start. Receive now Dr. Ecklund.
Thank you, Cleve. Thank you for coming tonight, and I mean really thank you. I know that many of you feel like maybe you should be someplace else doing something else, and we really do not take your time lightly. I want to thank too Haley Hemstreet. We had started out tonight's evening as a program on religious discrimination, which we will be sure to come back to and honor that commitment to do a program on that topic. But I came into the research office last week, and Haley said, what do you think about flipping next week's program and directly responding to what's going on in Houston? And I said I was thinking the same thing, but I was afraid to ask, and she said, I'm already on it. And so just the lion's share of work and thanks goes to her. Also to Cleve, who agreed to step up and moderate, and to Dan Bolger for helping develop what you have in your hands, which is a research piece that our students have put together to just highlight some recent research, which might be helpful. Our city has faced over the last days one of its most significant outside challenges, and I think it's safe to say that from many corners we have responded with a sense of resilience. There are hands of help represented here. Well over 2,000 students from the Rice University campus under the leadership of the Door Institute for New Leaders, Tom Holdens is with us tonight, and other campus groups have been very involved in volunteering in the community. And those of you in these seats, some of you who I know quite well, have represented just countless efforts to help those in need. In one sense, I have a sort of a profound feeling of guilt that I'm even here at all, that we maybe ought to be out doing something that feels more hands-on. But in another sense, I think this might be exactly where we should be. Perhaps a unique role for a university-based program like ours, like the Religion and Public Life program, is to document, to learn from, and to amplify the efforts of others, to in effect to bring the best relevant research that we might have on how to be the most helpful back to the community. And we want to start to do that here. We acknowledge that this is only a minor start. So we're here tonight to collect up what we've been learning. We've been out and about with the students, doing some volunteering, but also documenting what religious organizations in coalition with other kinds of organizations in Houston are doing in response to Harvey. We want to provide a relevant, small space for reflection tonight, I draw your attention again to the research inset. We'd be very interested to hear if there are other things that we should be doing in the days ahead to bring you more relevant research. We also want to provide a space to tell our stories. Here's what some of the initial research that we are doing and that others are doing shows us. A quote from one of the religious leaders that we've talked with who said, "Fear is an integral part of most religious experiences, and a crisis like the one we're experiencing is the catalyst used to create more group cohesion." So we're seeing more group cohesion, and this is in parallel with other research, that faith communities are coming together when they face an outside threat like a natural disaster. We're seeing individuals in the community, those with faith, those outside faith communities, who are leaning on one another for resilience. We're seeing faith communities across traditions join together, both with other congregations and organizations within their traditions, but also with those outside their traditions. Congregations in Houston, many of which are represented here, have helped thousands upon thousands through relief efforts, and we certainly want to acknowledge that. But now that some time has passed after the storm, we want to also think about what research and other insights from those of you who are here might teach us about how to go forward meaningfully after the storm. Harvey was remarkably pervasive in the damage it caused. It hit the homes of both rich and poor. The damage was remarkably pervasive. I think it's safe to say that anyone in this room has either experienced or knows intimately someone who experienced extraordinary loss during this time. And having our city in this kind of mass devastation influences us all. Some are saying about this storm, it's a storm that did not discriminate. Some estimate that nearly 30,000 people will continue to need shelter following Tropical Storm Harvey. But my social science colleagues tell me, and others who've done research on disasters, that those who are the poorest to begin with, those who work in an itinerant budget or hourly wage without benefits, those who are without insurance, those who are without access to a social network of others who have financial resources, those who are discriminated against already will be the most likely to suffer long term. My sociology colleague Jim Elliott has found in his research on disasters that there is a distinct relationship between disaster risk areas and vulnerable populations. So he puts it like this: over time, repeated exposure to disasters has the effect of polarizing rich and poor into distinct spatial areas, as well as increasing racial segregation in particular, such that those who are less able to cope with disasters tend to become concentrated and segregated into areas that are most prone to disasters. So this is not Harvey, but this is a FEMA map which shows the areas of Houston that are most prone to flood. And it's also the areas of Houston that tend to be the lowest socioeconomically. I'm happy to provide this later. This is being taped for any of you who want to see it up close. These are special flood hazard areas. So now what can we do? I put a lot of thought, the team put a lot of thought into trying to just get a conversation started about how we can usefully move forward, and knowing, acknowledging up front that it's necessarily a completely inadequate conversation, but we need to move forward in some way that's meaningful. Research tells us that people want to respond well. Often we hear media accounts of looting and the worst side of people coming out during disasters. Actually, research shows us that often it's the best side of people that come out post-disaster if we think most pervasively about what's happened rather than amplifying isolated incidences. And especially in the poorest communities, congregations are often the first responders. So in the poorest communities, congregations are often the most prevalent civic organization and are often the first responders. But research also shows that people are most likely to help those they know. So then that means that in the poorest communities, we have the poorest people helping the poorest people. So what can we do as faith and civic leaders, university leaders who are gathered, to think creatively about how we can use our networks and our organizations to redistribute resources to the people who need them most? That's really hard. And so that's going to be, I don't tell you exactly how to do that because I don't know. But that's the large question that we need to be asking ourselves. Research also shows this, that most help after natural disasters is relatively short term. Those who volunteer intensively, and the response that we've seen, and I want to be very careful here, the enormous outpouring of response needs to be honored. But those who volunteer intensively initially are very likely to burn out, and the help goes away very quickly. So here are just 3 points that I want to make, and then I'm very excited to hear what my esteemed colleagues have to say. But 3 things that I think just to start thinking about what we can do. So reflect on real need. Reflect on real need. There's an enormous desire in me as a person to just do something, to feel like I am meaningfully contributing. And I think that's a wonderful impulse that we all have. I sense it in all of you here. But how can we get better information about where help is needed most? How can we coordinate our efforts among one another? At the organizational level, how can religious leaders join in with efforts of other religious leaders rather than duplicating efforts? And asking yourselves as leaders, what kind of organizations can we partner with? Perhaps some new partnerships will even be gained here tonight. Are there other civic organizations, other government organizations that we can be partnering with? There's a pretty big research literature that shows that partnerships have the most effective long-term impact rather than solo organization efforts. At the individual level, as persons who are gathered here, who may or may not be part of organizations, reflecting on where we are best used. So in the long term, in the immediate, we may be called upon literally to help our neighbor who lived next door, as a friend who was with us tonight at my house before said. Long term, think about what kinds of particular skills you have that could be used most effectively. Don't be afraid to go against the flow. If your thing is not ripping out drywall, but you can provide meaningful legal help or other kinds of help, then maybe that's your thing. So where can your skills be most meaningfully used? Where does your skill set and your passions most meaningfully meet the world around us and the needs? Thirdly, I say, especially for those who are leading organizations, how can we together think long term? I'm trying to ask myself this. As leaders, we have very particular kinds of responsibilities. Many of you have told me, have told others as we were out and gathering information in the city these past days, that you have experienced stories of incredible resilience and incredible strength. How can you amplify those stories and encouragement to others, and how can you help other people tell their stories? How can we lead our communities long term to leverage the kind of compassion and social cohesion that's happening now? So this gives us a special opportunity for compassion and social cohesion. What can we do to make that last? If our organization houses those with above average incomes, and I recognize this is very hard because of pervasive need within our organizations, what can we do to encourage people to give outward? And how can we encourage long-term financial giving to the areas that have been the most vulnerable? How can we continue to activate the networks and the coalitions that we have built? And how can we learn from what we're experiencing now in a way that will help other cities that experience disasters? These are just questions. They are hard questions. They are not questions that I certainly have the answers to. But I think the encouragement here is that what we've seen and what we've done, and there has been much in this group, this room represents people at the forefront of helping others, that we have a kind of capacity that together we can do much. more. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Greg Hahn. I am the Director of Interfaith Relations at Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston. I introduced myself as a Midwestern-raised, half-Asian, Jesuit-educated, Harvard-trained, Texas-residing Presbyterian. That's the quick
A lot of boxes you have there.
I am moving on, I guess, to the first question, to describing what our agency is doing. Is that correct? I work for Interfaith Ministries, which is Houston's oldest interfaith service organization. The strength of shared beliefs, dialogue, collaboration, and service are the mottos, the straws that stir our drink. So we've done a variety of things since our opening existence in the mid-1950s. So what we have been doing recently, first and foremost, has been a lot of things, because we do a lot of things, but first and foremost are getting our two major direct services back online. Meals on Wheels and refugee services. We got our Meals on Wheels. We're Houston's largest Meals on Wheels program. We're the fifth largest in the country. And first and foremost, knowing that almost all of the people that are Meals on Wheels clients are already in vulnerable populations, we needed to get out there. They all had 5 days worth of shelf-stable meals to get them through. We knew that unless they had eaten them already, they've gone through 4 of them. And so we got out there on Friday, not only to do our job, but also to assess and help them in a variety of ways. And using our connections, I got a call from one of our assessors saying that there was a grandmother who had lost 3 of her grandchildren in the floods and said she needs spiritual care. I said, can you give me some more information? And she said, identifies as Catholic, not part of a parish, and speaks English. So I went right to one of the interesting things that has happened is my connections, which I have, are deep, but they've gotten deeper. So now I'm texting with the director of the Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas, as well as the judicial vicar, saying, this is a need, this is a person, this is her address. 15 minutes later, the person texts back, that's right next to this parish. I've got a priest on the way. So that's really some of the cool things that have happened. Refugee services as well. From there, the other thing is that our Office of Interfaith Relations and Community Partnerships has taken on into our family of services Volunteer Houston, which means we're deeply involved in disaster response. We were charged through Volunteer Houston to basically come in and take over the volunteer management of the George R. Brown. So so we had a couple of staff that were pulling 30, 35-hour shifts getting that up and running. They've slept since then, thankfully. Then I think a lot of our other work, Volunteer Houston, Meals on Wheels, Refugee Services, is then, I describe my work not necessarily as a hub, but as a node in a larger network. And it is wonderful. I'm honored to be up here speaking, but I also want the people that I see out there, a lot of I'm speaking on your behalf, because I know the work. I know the work that you're doing. Some of you I'm familiar with, some of you I've been in contact with. I know the work you're doing. You are on the front lines. I also want to say that this is a multi-faith effort. The Islamic Society of Greater Houston has been unbelievable. I've seen through our work, there's a larger organization called VOAD, Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. That is a national organization, but at the local level, there's a Gulf Coast VOAD. It's an organization of organizations that are active in disaster, and the leadership is they all have other jobs. For example, the current chair is Matt Johns, whose full-time job is with Catholic Charities. And this organization, we hosted a meeting at Interfaith Ministries of the member organizations working and groups that have come in. ICNA, Islamic Circle of North America, SEVA, predominantly out of the Hindu community, ISGH, Suchi, a lot of the ones that are listed there, Catholic Charities, International Orthodox Church Charities, the Shia Ismailis community.
And so as a United Methodist, one of the things that goes into action within my own denomination is UMCOR, which is a large organization that has at its disposal these kind of massive institutional things that it can begin to do. Really on the local level, what we're doing is linking up with organizations, folks that we've become deep friends with, really in some improbable ways. One of those is folks here even tonight with Black Lives Matter, Houston, Texas, and Project Curate in St. Paul's. Because we operate in different portions of the city and have different friendship networks, but there's connections between us all, we've been able to pool resources and we've been able to deploy those resources in some amazing ways. And so the folks at Bread of Life and Black Lives Matter Houston, Texas have been joining, and we've been really actually joining with them in their efforts, which are quite amazing. And I need to let y'all talk about this because y'all, Secunda, y'all and Carrie are doing amazing work in the city that we're a part of. And because of that, we're able to move a lot more freely into these kind of friendship networks. One of the places that I've spent the last 2 or 3 days has been in apartment buildings with undocumented workers. And mainly, we've been pulling out things out of and redoing apartments, but it's really been, in some ways, working with the apartment owners, finding and realizing that most of these apartment owners that we're working with don't have insurance because they don't have to as private owners. So there's no flood insurance. They're not going to apply for FEMA. And so they are dedicated to replacing as the least amount of sheetrock as possible. And so what we're attempting to do, and quite successfully so far, is to move into a number of these apartments and working with these folks saying, here, this is our promise that we will leave you better than we found you. But this is also what we need from you. We need you to sign an agreement that you will not evict our friends. These are our folks. We eat with them, we share life with them, we suffer with them, we have joy with them. And so far we've had success in doing that because we're investing in property that's not our own, but in places where it's already mold infested. So we're being able to rip out 4 feet of sheetrock in these apartments and replace them and really kind of do some mold treatment and those kinds of things. And our partnerships around the city as well, being able to share resources has been really important. And so as we begin to understand and working, say, with Brandy, and realizing that there are resources that they have that we need and resources that we have that folks in the different parts of the city need. And so we're able to form those kinds of quick track kind of networks quickly around those things. I think also as a faith community, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. Part of our job is to absorb the pain and desperation of people. I find it easy to replace sheetrock, but I think part of our call as not just faith leaders, but as humans, is to stand in places where people are finding many places of ineffability, unspeakable kind of trauma, which is really compacting for many folks, trauma that has happened in past. And as humans, as people of faith, it's not just that we're replacing sheetrock, it's how we are treating folks and material possessions of folks that don't have much in the beginning. And not just going in and just grabbing beds and moving them out, but being very gentle and asking them, what do you need? What is it like? What does it feel like? We're here for not just to remove, but to be with. And so part of that, I think, is not just what we're doing, but how we're doing it. It's what my Episcopal friends will call the care of all souls. And that is the care in which I think the faith community can move into and begin to absorb some of both the trauma and the desperation that comes up for folks. And we do this then, I think, across lines in these network relationships that we're invested in.
So now we'll ask our panelists to move forward if you don't mind, and we have some questions for them. And a lot of this has to do with sort of the interrogation of what does religious organizations have to do with real crises. The moments happen in our community when it calls for a response. What's the relationship between faith communities and their proximity? So we want to start this question for all of you, talking about that unique role. What would you say is a unique role for religious organizations and how they play that role in disaster relief, especially? How have you seen? What do you think is the unique role for faith and religious organizations?
I'll just say a brief matter, and then you all are much more on the ground and I think can fill in. So there hasn't been, sadly, very much research on how religious organizations respond to disasters. But the little bit of research that has been done would tell us that religious organizations tend to be first responders. Now that doesn't say anything about whether they're particularly effective first responders or anything, but they tend to be first responders. So they tend to be the organizations that people call on first for help. The second thing I would say is that religious traditions across the board have as a mandate of most of their belief systems to provide help in times of crises. And so there is a built-in motivation to help. Again, I'm not making an argument about whether people actually do activate that, but I think there is a commandment. And then thirdly, we know from lots of research on political mobilization, voluntarism, that religious organizations are, people who are part of religious organizations are group kind of people, meaning that they join stuff and do stuff, that they have networks with others, and so there is a built-in kind of capacity building networking opportunity that I think is somewhat distinctive from other kinds of organizations.
I think Dr. Ecklund has summarized it really well. I think the other things I would add that are unique, I think the first thing is that the value and the need for, I think the sociological term is social capital, is alive and well. This idea of bowling alone is not, it's not there. I think it's a Robert Putnam book. That the need for social capital is still there, that technology is not going to replace it, technology will augment it. I've never used Slack more in the last 4 days than I have, and than I have in the past 4 years. I'm a very private person in a lot of ways, and I was telling Matt, I have never made a post on Facebook public until about a week ago. When I posted something and someone said, will you make that public? And I was like, And suddenly over the last week, I've made every post public, and I'm trying not to get used to it, okay? I think that faith communities already have some language of spiritual and emotional care. And that, I think, long term is going to be something that is really, 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 really necessary. I think we have a built-in model of action and reflection. That's really, really important, that we do a lot of action, but there is that aspect, that Friday Juma prayers or Friday Shabbat or Saturday or Sunday services that has at least some component of sitting still and listening. I think just two other things, the value of connection, that the sense that faith communities are often have a sense we're here for the long haul. We have a sense of history. Stuff happened before we were here, stuff's going to happen after we were here. And finally, I think something that's been really important here is that I think this Harvey has been a kick in the pants for faith communities to as a distinct reminder of why they exist, why we exist in the first place.
I also think that the faith community has a prophetic role to play within the city of Houston, mainly among, and mainly it's a recipient of the prophetic and I want to say more privileged white communities. Because in privileged white communities, we do a really good job at kicking in times like this. Because we know it's short term, we know that really not much will change. And so we do really well, and we'll share stories on Facebook all day long about all these great things. But it exposes a lack of imagination that we have as a faith community as well. That really what we've led ourselves to is to a type of capitalism and a type of desire for more, that when we as a faith community are then exposed and moved into the deep inequalities within our city, we have to make a decision. Do we turn that off? Do we other people? Do we feel really good about some sheetrock? Or do we begin to think about the educational inequalities in our city? Do we think about the hunger that exists in our city? This is nothing new. Harvey did not cause this. It might have exposed some privileged people to the fact that we live in a really broken and desperate city. And so the question I think that we have to wrestle with as a faith community is not how we react in crisis. We do that well. It's how we are going to change our imagination within the city of Houston, and might we be converted towards the margins? That's the question I have. If not, I don't think that our faith communities are worth going to tell you the truth. And I think that those that are not being converted towards the margins, I'm not sure what they are. I just wouldn't ascribe faith to them.
Well, since you have the mic, I'll just start with you, Matt, and I'll use my Baptist voice so you can hear me. A question related to that. Matt, you mentioned earlier some of your community partnership work with other community-based organizations. There are also governmental agencies such as FEMA, Red Life, you mentioned partners with governmental organizations with. I want to ask each of you a question specifically about what do you think are some of the barriers to churches or faith communities partnering with organizations that they don't typically partner with, whether it's governmental-based or community-based, whether it's activists or other organizations. What are some of the barriers you think exist to that?
You want me to go there?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways we have allowed a type of rhetoric to be fostered and nurtured and not checked. And so there's a sense in which there's certain organizations at certain places in the city that get labeled. And if Vixenstein is right, if words and worlds are coterminous, if they create each other, if they're a part of that creating, then we've let a rhetoric happen that divides us from each other. And so there's certain organizations, whether that's Black, white, Latino, that in some Asian, that in some ways have been marginalized from each other. And I think the work is to let that go and to actually befriend each other. It's really simple. This is not rocket science, although we live in a rocket city. It's really simple. I think it's what Mother Teresa describes as the human issues, that we just have forgotten that we belong to each other. And so as we have this moment of opening up, I think part of that there is, again, I've mentioned some of the sense of maybe both the inequality and the racism that exists within our city that we have to face. And I think that's part of the things that happen. I think also I'm working along a lot of undocumented folks right now, and they're really afraid of reaching out to FEMA, particularly in the last 2 days. We organized about 75 in an apartment complex 3 days ago to talk about FEMA, and had some pretty good confidence that at least the kids that had Social Security, if we were talking with some of these lawyers, if we came together as a bundle bundle. If the kids went through, we would be able to then secure some of the FEMA, but the DACA thing blew that all out of the water. And so you have folks that are already afraid that are on top of these institutions that want to help, but if you feel like the raised nail gets the hammer in a sense. And so you have a whole other set of deprivation that then just gets patted down on top of that. So.
And Greg, before you go, I mean, you mentioned earlier that, how you would like to see some, you mentioned the human aspect. So in your interfaith work, I'm interested in hearing more about how does that work for you, partnering with other community organizations, and how does your interfaith work reach out to those who are not particularly a part of religious tradition, per se?
I guess I would answer that question by saying, in some ways, there's no such thing as interfaith. Very few people really describe themselves as interfaith. Interfaith happens when a nexus occurs between faith traditions, and I use that word expansively. When by 2050, a quarter of the U.S. adult population is going to be that nothing in particular. That doesn't mean that they're not religious or spiritual, whatever. And there's a wonderful opportunity. I tell folks that are in churches saying the landscape's changing. Religion's not dying. People's spirituality is just changing and growing. It's on this journey. So working with folks who are not religious, they're usually more fun to start with, and often more imaginative. And, I don't know about that. So I think we just need, in some ways, a more expansive understanding of what we mean about people's faith. And then that's a lot of the fun. And then within my work, between the beginning of July and the beginning of August, I chronicled I was at different houses of worship. I was at like 13 of them in 8 weeks doing different things, and it's just an incredible city. So I think we need to be thinking just a little more imaginatively. It's not hard. I would agree with Matt, but in this case, it's not hard. We just need to be thinking more about what we mean by faith, and that there's a lot of faith in the city, and it just looks at just a lot of different ways, thankfully.
I'm not a faith leader, but can I say something?
Certainly.
Something that struck me based on what Matt said is that there's a huge research literature in the social sciences that talks about the principle of homophily, which is like is attracted to like. And we naturally like to be with the people and like the people who we think are like us, right? That's sort of the short way to say it. And something which a natural disaster can catalyze is an expansive notion of who is like us. So there's a sense where a push from the outside can make us say, well, we're in this together as people who are part of Houston, so our identity can expand. And so maybe something for us to think about and discuss is there any possibility here? Yeah. So there are enormous barriers, which I think we've really pointed out well. But what are the possibilities for bridging with other organizations that we tend to be, like you're saying, like, don't go there. Those people are not like us. You see people in my academic world standing at conferences, you're standing in a circle talking, people are coming up from the outside trying to talk to you, and you tend to close the circle rather than step back to let other people in, right? Like we see this all the time. So what are ways in which we can use this to expand the circle? I ask myself. Others, maybe, on this panel.
I want to I think a funny story. Last night there was a meeting at St. John's United Methodist Church, and I do think disasters have this funny habit of creating strange alliances or just putting people in the room. So there's somebody from FEMA. I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, saying, and if you get denied, just keep trying again and again. And then there is a lawyer from Lone Star Legal Aid down in the front saying, if you get denied, come talk to us, as she's almost waving at the FEMA guy like they're friends, but knowing that FEMA is in some way just the enemy, which it's not. But it was just fascinating how there's Lone Star Legal Aid and FEMA in the back, and they're waving at each other, saying, if they mess with you, you come talk to us, and we'll try to get it worked out. So there is this notion of, for definitely disaster, forcing these strange convergences of people I think the question is whether or not we're going to leverage, it's neither good nor bad, it just sort of is, how are we going to leverage or take advantage of those opportunities, or are we going to go back into our own little enclaves?
If you don't mind, I want to ask you to stay with Dr. Ecklund. She does, so Dr. Ecklund does, also she's my mentor, so it's hard for me to ask her a question as well. But you've done a lot of research in different churches. You've done science and collaboration and faith and different ones. How do you see, how would you think, how can we encourage more collaboration among diverse faith?
And a situation like this causes us to focus more on practices, right? Like we start to look at what people are really doing. And so maybe the question we ought to be asking ourselves, just, and again, I'm thinking off the top of my head, organizationally, is not like how can I get with people who believe like I do, but how can I get with the people who are doing things that I want to be doing, and maybe they don't believe like I do, right? Or maybe I can change what I believe to learn some stuff from them, or they can change what, like, just sort of not start there with joining with I even say it, like join with like-minded people, but maybe we ought to start with joining with like-practicing people. So I appreciated your highlighting of the humanist community in Houston, which most faith communities would not think of joining with, but who are stepping up and doing things that, you know, as people of faith, we would want to be recognized as also doing. So so I'm, again, right off the top of my head, but that's something that I've been thinking about during this time. Yeah, thanks for asking that.
So I'll ask one more question for the panel before I open up to the floor. Right now, Hurricane Irma may be en route to Florida. We hope it misses it, but right now it's projected to landfall there. Those of you who have been on the ground, and also those of you who have observed it from afar, what do you think religious organizations can or should be doing to be more prepared for it right now, based on your experiences here?
Sir.
Okay.
We're mic limited. Yes, we have one, if you've not noticed.
I crowdsourced this question, and I got responses both from friends in the Muslim community and friends in the in the Episcopal community, and I asked them what should we be doing, and they said this, and I don't know if this can answer the Irma question. Irma's less than 2 days away, I guess, if it hits Florida, but my friend in the Muslim community said this: moving forward, I think each organization has to be better prepared in the event such a disaster or other calamities occur again. ISGH and its teams mobilize very fast. I think religious organizations such as churches, mosques, temples, faith communities, your house church, have to be able to open up the shelters and have to have sufficient supplies to accommodate anyone needing shelter in their areas. We must have teams trained for rescuing, welcoming, coordinating. I know for the Muslim community, I will start with educating and training the community on disasters and disaster relief. So a lot of it is preparation, for sure. At the same time, it was extremely impressive to see all interfaith alliances come together and support each other, regardless of faith or any other factor. And then from Trinity Episcopal Church, they said, we learned some lessons from Ike and the tax day floods and prepared a volunteer coordination team a day or two before the storm hit. This is Trinity Episcopal in the Woodlands. We set up Google Docs to centralize names of volunteers, what the needs were from church members, and gather a database of information as to what resources there were for people in the surrounding areas. We mucked out houses the first week, tending to members of our church. Now we've identified a vulnerable community that lost everything and has no resources to get on their feet. So again, I don't know if that answers the Irma question, because Irma's really close, but that's some of the things that, when I asked that second question, what can faith communities do in the future, that's how they answered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good.
I would just say briefly, one of the friends that we're working with is a guy named Lupe Mendez, who is both Jesuit and an activist within the Latinx community. One of the things we realized in working in some of these apartments is some people just fled and not come back, and we don't know where they are. And so there's a real need to set up shelters that aren't requiring IDs. And so in some ways, making sure that we have our eyes on the most vulnerable and the easily displaced. And so we're attempting, he's attempting through his networks to locate these folks and for us to find churches that would take folks in that are easily displaced. Some of the apartments, as you know, you'll have one person that signs the lease, but 2 or 3 families living in there, right? And so there's a number of folks that you just don't know where they are. And so I think being able to mobilize, and some of that is making sure, this is, in the wake of this is the work we have to do as our city, is to make sure that these networks kind of span boundaries. Mm-hmm. We have to become much more of a faith community of people. I think faith, another word for faith is just trust. We have to trust each other. And so as we learn to trust each other across our differences and to not just across the difference, but rejoicing in those as well, we find, I think, that there's a network that is set up around those kinds of things. So I would say that. The other is realizing that so many folks in the city are living paycheck to paycheck. That what people don't need, I'm coming in contact with now, is they don't need sheetrock ripped out. They need a check for an apartment person that's about to evict them, and they don't care if Harvey happened or not. They don't care if Irma's coming or not. And so in some ways, it's us being prepared for donations. Folks around the country, and even Cleve and I have been in England, have asked to partner with us as kind of sister organizations. What can we send stuff? And we're saying, right now we could use money because we want to be able to sustain people that are out of work, and not just sustain people out of work. What we're end up doing is hiring people to do this work. Right, so we've got a whole set of Latinx women that are cooking dinner for the relief folks that are working across the city. So we're hiring women using the kitchen of churches that we're purchasing the meals for, then to feed. And so I think being able to have those networks in the future is crucial.
We have time for one more question for the panel. It's not on the sheet, but forgive me. But I'm interested, we talked about collaboration. I'll start with Dr. Ecklund. I'm interested from hearing from all of you about how do you think researchers and practitioners can partner to do the thing? What is the role of research in this? If it wants to be practical at all, how can it help the work that's happening in these communities? I know it's something we thought about a lot, so.
No, I don't know. Do you guys want to answer first? You want me to answer first?
Yeah, whoever.
I think I put myself in this camp, but I think as researchers, we need to think more about how to translate our research well to people who can use it. So that's a huge motivation of mine. I would say I'm trying. And then the flip side of that for me is then listening to people in different kinds of publics, right, in different kinds of communities, to know whether that message is being heard and how it could be better. So I can think that I'm doing an awesome job translating, and no one understands my translation. So is there a way that we can then partner with organizations that could benefit from research and then find out how they could benefit and how we can do the research in a way that they can hear? And then secondly, I would say from the researcher point of view, something that research provides that is really, really hard to say in this kind of situation is it provides reflection on what could be best for the long haul. And the tendency, and I feel it very profoundly even as I say this, is to think about short-term need, but we want to make long-term structural changes, and in its best form, research could provide to some extent information that could then be used by ourselves and others to do that.
I think of 3 things. I think some research like Dr. Ecklund has done on the role belief plays could be always is helpful on how belief reflecting on how belief manifests itself in productive ways and also ways that aren't so productive. So I think there's the belief side. I think I think any data and good research, and I think it's out there, but I think some research done particularly for Houston that can speak to Houston's context for the next time this happens, because I'm pretty sure it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, is then that can really answer what counts when. And maybe that's for us also the Irma question. What do you think you would have wanted? And just apply that to Irma. So don't send clothes, send money. I know money's not sexy. You want to feel like you send something, but you need money. And then do your research on where you want to send it. So what counts the most when? And then finally, the one about substantive changes and hard choices. Just as an example, would some research show that there are some areas of Harris County we need to abandon and not rebuild? And that's a hard choice. But it's a long-term substantive choice that could help in the long run. So I think the sort of data that could actually be the kind of things that you can't ignore that asks those tough long-range questions in the world that we're living in could be really helpful research-wise.
My dissertation advisor always used to say that in research, one of the questions you always have to ask is who benefits. And so I think one of the primary concern about research is to ask who benefits out of this research. Is it the institution or is it the people that are actually being researched? And I would also say that there needs to be a deep mixed method type of research. There's a type of research that hands surveys out and asks opinions. There's another type of research that's a deeper ethnography that actually smells. And so I think we need both of those things. We need both quantitative and qualitative research. But the research has to smell like feet or it's not research. If it doesn't smell like the inside of an immigrant's house, it's not research. If it doesn't get me closer to the way that reality is, then it's not research. And so I think part of that is who benefits, is asking that question. And then I would say this again, I think this is why I'm drawn to Dr. Ecklund's work as well, that it has to inspire a new imagination. It has to tell us who we are. It has to give us a clear view of reality. That's what good research does. It says this is where you're standing. And research is always biased. It always, Bertrand Russell said every way of seeing is just another way of not seeing. I get that. But we see through research, but it also has to expand our horizons. If research does not expand our horizons, become more human, in a Greek sense, more kenotic, to more self-emptying of ourselves into each other, then I'm not sure who benefits out of that.
Great. Now we have time for questions from the audience. Raise your hand and I'll try to see the first one I can. We'll start there.
My name is Samantha Smith. I'm from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Bel Air. I'm new to Houston in the last 2 months.
Hey, welcome.
I'm not new to the Gulf Coast, but I'm new to Houston. And
Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you.
yeah, this has been great. It's been very enlightening for me. For people like me, or people who are we're very, what I tend to say is insular in our denomination most of the time. How do we identify community assets that are wider than the Episcopal Church? I hear you talk a lot about collaboration and partnership across faith organizations. I don't know that they exist, and I'm happy for the impetus to be on us to look those up, but with research and things like that give us best practices and there are networks that are already established, how are we communicating those and how do we plug into those, and do we make a database of every faith organization in Houston? You know, what is that like?
We're trying to do that, actually.
Good luck.
Angela's on my advisory committee and Laura and James and others here. So one quick thing I would say is that Reverend Hahn really, I think, well pointed out that during these times of disaster, you do have an impetus to reach out to people you don't know. So then to maintain those relationships past the disaster. So this is a horrific event that provides a uniquely amazing opportunity.
Not like it's like a funeral in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and then to seek, this is a network theory kind of thing, but to seek the counsel of others who appear to be well connected, who can connect you to others that you want to connect with. That was cumbersomely stated. But if someone like Greg, who then works with multiple religious leaders, then would know your passions and would know who you could be then connected to, are two quick things that come to mind. These events that we hold here, that other like organizations hold around the city, I do notice that there's a remarkably diverse set of people that are really starting to come out and desire to make connections. And so, I think you being here tonight is an enormous first step.
What is your name?
Samantha.
Samantha. Yeah, in some ways, I would encourage you to get to know the person right in front of you, this woman Secunda, who's doing so much work in the city. And just in you two meeting each other, there's a network that's formed. Because Secunda will introduce you to a billion people that you never have access to, that she's been working with in the trenches with her friends for years, right? So some of this is this can make us more human, right? I think databases are absolutely necessary. But when the shit hits a fan, we usually call people we know, right? And so I think that part of this is the impetus to break bread together and not to use each other in transactional ways, but to form bonds of trust. And in those bonds of trust, we become more human. Because the shit's going to hit the fan next week too and something else, right? And the question is, have we taken the time to get to know each other so that we don't treat each other as transactions in the midst of a crisis? Those things have to happen. We're doing that well as a city. We can do that better. But will that end up a long haul, in a sense, making us different people in a different city?
Just to add to that, that means also breaking some habits and actually convincing the powers that be that when they ask, what did you do last week? Well, I had lunch with this person, and I had lunch with this person, I had lunch with this person, I had lunch with this person, I went to this meeting and met this person, I had a conversation with this person, and then our model is, well, no, what did you actually do? That's going to have to twist that on its head, that actually is incredibly substantive work of making connections and then the hard work of keeping those up and keeping them formed. That doesn't show up on a ledger really well when it comes to personnel review at the end of the year, but it just needs to be convinced that that relational work is incredibly profitable in the best way possible. We just don't often see it that way.
Can I also just say something really quick about that too? I know we'll shut up. I think also the artists and the poets and the musicians right now are really important too. That I was, as a person of faith, I was searching for words on Sunday, and sometimes it's really important just to shut up, and it's silence. But there's a poet friend of mine that sent me a poem that he had written, and he used that as a call. And it in a sense opened up space that I was having a hard time stepping in myself. Right? And so I think we have to keep our eyes on artists like Lanicia and poets like Ube and Bean and other ones in the city that are doing really amazing things to help us give words when there aren't, and to open up space where we don't know how to open that space up.
During Harvey, one of the more publicized stories of the faith community in Houston was, as it usually
Mattress Max, right?
It was Lakewood Church in Joel State. And so there arose this narrative that they were keeping the church closed as a shelter, and they only opened as a shelter when sort of public pressure became sort of too powerful. And so my question is, given the reaction to Osteen and Lakewood's perceived reluctance to open its doors as a shelter, we don't have to go into all the actual stuff of it. What can we learn about our society's expectations of religious communities? And what does it tell us about the social role we still demand of religious organizations, especially in times of crisis?
I think you answered the question. So in the sense that, I think it was Dan, you pointed out when we were doing some, work on what's the media saying about what religious organizations are doing, that of course had a lot of press, but it does show the underlying expectation that the largest faith communities will do something in times of disaster. And that in and of itself is indicative of the social role that faith communities are expected to play. And when they don't, they're sanctioned, right? I mean, and I don't know all the details of what happened, but it shows that there is an incredible demand, as well as I think an opportunity, right? That the world, regardless of faith, is ready to receive the actions of faith communities at some level. And that, to me, as a social scientist, was just fascinating in and of itself, and at some level should be seen as an odd kind of opportunity perhaps for the rest of us.
Can you respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity, I'm just thinking out loud a little bit. Maybe there is a concern about whether they were going to do it right or what was the right time. I think another lesson, and I know preparation is very important, but I think this is also a time for faith communities to remember that they're called to risk and to make mistakes, and we're a very risk-averse culture. So that may be a reflective opportunity as well about faith communities remembering you're going to do it wrong, that there's a reason they call these things disasters, because they're unplannable in some ways, even with the best planning, but maybe we're called to risk as well.
Hi, my name is Jim Wallace. I'm relatively new to Houston. My affiliation is with Boston University. My question is this. You talked about the short term, that faith communities tend to be first responders. You've also, in your insert, talked about the donation fatigue that quickly sets in, and that's what churches tend to depend on, the faith communities depend on. The estimates that have been floating around are that to rebuild, it will cost $108 billion, more than Katrina and Sandy put together. Okay? Today at the White House, there was a deal worked out with congressional leaders for $7.89 billion. But as soon as Irma hits on the weekend, Houston's are going to quickly be forgotten. So 180 billion minus 7.89, we're still looking at, 171.11 billion that we've got to deal with. I've heard no one talk about political strategies. What are the political strategies to make sure that, right now the battle's been fought on the streets and the bayous of Houston, but the real battle for the money will be fought in the Russell office building, the Longworth office building, and the Dirksen office building in DC. That's where the battle's going to be fought. What is being done to develop political strategies and to mobilize that? Because the representatives and the senators from Houston, from Texas and from Houston in particular, are buoyed by political support from the masses. And if there's not a strategy to take the faith community and help them continue to press for the money, there's going to be a whole lot bigger problem that's going to be happening in 3 to 6 months. Are your organizations that work with other organizations, do you do anything in the political realm? Has any research been done about the political aspect of dealing with disasters? Not just churches going out and giving bread, cutting down sheetrock and doing that. There's a big long-term battle which you referenced that has to be dealt with.
Jim, that's a great question. Thanks for bringing it up. So first, initially, you probably know this, is enormous social science literature on the relationship between religion and politics. For good or bad, religion and politics are deeply connected in the United States. Let's let that settle in. I think that makes certain kinds of faith communities enormously skittish of getting involved because they don't want to be part of the perception of the bad place of religion and politics being connected. And perhaps what you're prophetically saying is this might be a missed opportunity to leverage our enormous social connection to respond well as a group. Obviously, there's been no research done right now in the last week on what we're doing, but this is a great commendation for a way forward, that this is what we call structural change, right? That we need to be thinking about how we're going to use our collective assets to leverage and partner with government organizations to get the kind of help for repair that we need.
You know, I think honestly the church is ill-prepared for the question you just asked. I think that I think we're not prepared at all, and I think that shows one, our short-sightedness about our city and our world, and I also think that there's a sense in which the faith community says, well, that's not our job, and we pass on that. But I think that's why, I think that's a part, at least what I'm, and the folks that I've been talking with are talking about this new imagination that has a political sense to it. When I say political sense, meaning really for the common good. You know, how do we structure cities, living, goods and services, education, immigration issues, those kinds of things. And I don't think that the church has a comprehensive political way of moving into those.
And to draw you just briefly back to what Reverend Hahn, what Greg was saying, is that to do so feels very risky because the perception, that's why some major political movements, I think more recently, have decided to step outside of formal religious organizations because have not found the kind of political mobilization there that's necessary to address inequality. And so that's something which needs to really be thought through deeply.
Well, I also think it exposes a rift between our faith. At least I come out of a tradition, I no longer adhere to it as closely as my mom would probably wish I would, but which is really about getting out of the world. It's kind of a mass evacuation plan, right? And in some ways,
Inward Christian soldiers.
and I think really,
We're going to offend everyone here. That's the goal.
I think partly what this is exposing, at least in the era that we're moving into, is that that we have to be given to the world and to the city in ways that we have not had to be pressed as a church, because we've been able to occupy really a privileged space. Right, that no longer matters. I mean, we are no longer a contender for the attention of our society. And so the question is will we move in solidarity to the margins and to the places and give up, be given to? Right, and so that's the question I think that resides within kind of this capitalist kind of more stuff, or will we give ourselves to the margins more? And in a political sense, I think that's a great question.
I don't know. I think there could be the infrastructure there, but it's going to be sort of an analog of, are they going to allow themselves to be made strange bedfellows? So when I was in this VOAD meeting and I looked around at the faith communities that are represented, I think every sort of established faith community has some sort of policy arm or organizing arm that wants to speak to the halls of power. So I'm sure the Mennonite community has some sort of social policy arm. I'm looking at Marty Troyer out of the Mennonite community, or I know the ECUSA, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Seventh-day Adventists, the LDS, ICNA, ISNA, CARE, SEVA, you name it. They have infrastructure that's at that level where there could be a common word that is spoken, whether or not that, just as we're seeing it kind of at the micro level of strange bedfellows, whether that can happen at a macro level. So maybe I'm a little more optimistic that there seems to be structure there that the faith communities, whatever that means, could speak in a voice. It's just as difficult as it is to maintain those strange bedfellow or connections at this level as we're going to find it is at this level. So that I think that that it's there. It's just we're just seeing it difficult writ large. I could be wrong too. I have a couple other theories about this too. So,
any other questions from the audience?
Sure. So you touched a couple times upon this idea that those who were most acutely affected by Harvey were those who are most chronically affected by racism and poverty and abuse. And you know, it's Matt, you said it revealed all of that in a really explicit way. So my question is, going forward, how do faith communities parse those projects? You know, at what point are we doing Harvey relief and are we focused on Harvey and then pivot to the wider, you know, how do you frame those things, and do you frame them? Is it even useful to frame them?
And the question is, will we go back to sleep? You know? Antonio Machacato's poet I really like says all of Jesus' words can be summed up in one word: wake up. Right? And my hunch is that any religious teacher would say that. It's to wake up. And we're awake a little. The question is will we commit ourselves to feeling this uncomfortable for a lot longer? Because we're moving, all of us are moving in places on the edges. This kind of disaster is nothing new for folks, right? This is just a bad weekend with a bed that's gone south. And a paycheck they don't get, and another time to have to move. Right? So what gets upset is my privilege. That's what's getting upset. You know. So the question is, can we imagine it differently? Can I imagine it differently?
We have time for about one more question. Jim and Go ahead. I'm sorry, could you
talking to me?
Yeah, okay.
My name is Charles Talbot. I have a question. Our faith-based group, for this year, for the first time, we've traditionally helped out whenever there's, you know, the Memorial Flood and down at the Brazos River and all that, the Baton Rouge and all that. But we're doing something different this year. We're working with an organization or a program called CrisisCleanup.org. Has that made a difference? It seems to be, you're much more aware of what the needs are across the city. Do you find that that's made a difference?
I can't speak to that directly. I know that my mantra, I've got about 4 or 5 websites because when I've been in meetings, there's so much information flying around. So the thing that I'm thinking about, the question I was always asked, what are the 5 websites that I should tell people to be visiting regularly? So I've been saying Volunteer Houston and Crisis Cleanup. Yes, Crisis Cleanup I've heard all along the way as the kind of people funneling attention to crisis cleanup. It's not the only game in town for trying to match need with I can help with I need help, but that's the one I've heard the most. So I can't speak to it, but I've heard CrisisCleanup.org. I hear it in my sleep. So.
Thank you for saying that as a very practical thing. I wouldn't want us to leave tonight overwhelmed to inaction, right? So there's a sense where we're very susceptible as a community in this room of people who are really on the ground doing stuff. We're very susceptible to burnout. And so then where is the space for reflection that leads to right action? And what would that action then be? What's my narrow slice that I need to be, diving into? Is maybe something. These two are the spiritual leaders in the room, but that seems to be something that's common kind of sensibility that we want to emphasize. So thanks for mentioning, here's this website that you ought to look at.
Haley or not, do we have, we're beginning a conversation tonight, but we also want to make sure it's important that it's an ongoing conversation, so feel free to sort of email. I think there's a reception afterwards, which you continue to have a conversation with the panelists. Is there an email address that they can email the questions to? They have anything afterwards today?
Yes, absolutely.
If you go to our website, rplp.rice.edu, I'm on there.
Great.
Dr. Ecklund is on there.
So feel free to email any of the questions that you may not have gotten to today or tonight, and we're thankful for having a conversation. We have 5 more minutes, and I saw someone raise their hand. I want to make sure I get her question. Then I have a pardon question, if they don't mind, as we get out of here.
I have more of a comment, and it was just feeding off of his question about the websites, which are awesome and they're great. But what I find is a lot of times those websites, and sometimes it doesn't really, they don't reach the most affected community.
Yeah.
So there's some awesome things that I see, while, we're creating like maps and all sorts of things to kind of help get more focus on communities that, people just aren't aware of and don't know about. But those sites and the people who need help and the people who are actually, in those communities, they don't connect. So one of the things that Matt said earlier, that people to people, that person to person, and just reaching out is extremely important. Because if the people who are creating these sites and organizing this information are not connecting with the communities we're talking about, it's just a huge disconnect. So saying hello and, reaching out to folks that are, no matter what community you're in, there is a group or a section within that community of hurting people. So none of us in Harris County really have to go too far to find where that group is. That's just how, H-Town is set up. No zoning, so it's important to, start there.
That's a good word.
So we have 3 minutes. I have one question for the panelists related to short-term goals versus long-term, and also the question about politics and infrastructure. I wanted to ask you all the question, to what extent do you feel it's a religious organization responsibility to have more thoughtful conversations about the relationship to sort of say power, inequality, and all these other matters to help people be more prepared for these instances? Because like Dr. Ecklund mentioned, sometimes we can have these things what's practical, but how much do you feel it's the priest's responsibility or the pastor's responsibility to have more careful conversations with their members about the dynamics that really happen? Because for instance, Mr. Willis stood up and said, hey, what about what's happening in Washington? The truth of the matter is, only a certain amount of folk got access to that space, right? And so how do you feel the religious organization's responsibility is to kind of speak to that? And where do we feel we're either lacking or doing good?
I mean, I would say that that we have, in some ways, the word faith or whatever church, mosque, synagogue is on the line in these hours. I think in some ways we have the chance to become a prophetic voice in the city. And if we miss this chance, we have the tendency then to lapse back into comfort. The question is, what kind of city do we want to live in? Right? So if the disaster is exposed rather than created, and we understand that we're now exposed as a city in some ways, the question is, what will we do about that? What will our next action be? And so I think the call of the faith community is not to be involved in kind of movements of mass distraction. And I think a lot of times that's what happens when we don't know what to do. This is what Darwin says, that human species are the only critters that when they get lost, increase their speed. And so there's a sense in which we don't know what to do, so we'll just start doing more of whatever it is. We're going to start building websites, and whatever. I'm not saying that's wrong. I think we miss the prophetic calling then to speak into these instances of power and justice. And if we don't do that, I don't know what kind of faith community we have, right? And that's across the line. That's across the line.
My bias has been that faith communities are those spaces of action and reflection. We are places of thought. We are places that we not only talk about intelligence, but we talk about wisdom. And I remember, again, an article from Emily Click, who is a ministry studies at Harvard, at the Divinity School, talking about we have so much information at our hands, but we forget that it's one of the things that faith communities have as this beloved community of memory and hope. One of the favorite definitions of a faith community, or church in this case, is that we have access to wisdom. And that wisdom, I think, will be as much of a guide. Sometimes I'm a little pessimistic. I don't know if faith communities are they just social clubs now, or benevolence organizations? Do they just need to remember that claim that they have on thinking wisdom spaces too?
As a researcher, I've deferred to my historian colleagues here. It seems like the historical record would show us that some of the most powerfully effective political movements have been supported by or originated in faith communities. And when the faith community, whatever that is, has not supported movements of justice and spoken up for the weak, it has been very harshly judged by society later on. And I think there's a lot of information in the historical record that would help us there. There are others in this room, looking at Elias, who are probably more equipped to speak to these matters than I am, but that's something that immediately pops to mind, that it seems part of the societal expectation and responsibility that faith communities should act in these matters.
Can I say this too, that faith communities have to offer counter-narrative. If we are not offering a counter-narrative then to the narrative that we're receiving from, whether that's Washington or whether that's from just the marketing machine, if we're not a counter-narrative to say that there's another way of being, we can order our social relationships differently. If that's not coming out of the faith community, it has to be. We are a wisdom community, but there's a time also to be a prophetic community. Wisdom can be very passive. There's a time that the prophetic steps forward and says, this is the way. Walk in it. Right? And I think that's the moment that we have as a city. To begin to discover those things. Wisdom has to fall behind that and make sure that we don't wreck everything. That the prophet has to lead out and say, there's a different way of living together. And this is the time that we can make some of these micro moves that have larger impacts on people that are dying in the city tonight. And they were dying before Harvey hit, and they will be dying 2 years later. And do we give a damn about it? That's the question.
Here our balance a hand. So the formal conversation ends in here, but please don't rush out. Our panelists will be available for any questions or answers. Email any questions. Come and speak with Dr. Ecklund, Reverend Hahn, and Reverend Matthew Russell. And will you please join me again in giving them a warm applause. There's a reception out there. Food is available. Hang out with us for a while.